There is a version of this story where Marvin Gaye wins, where he walks into a room, plays his music, and watches James Brown fall silent, and then the credits roll and everything means something. But that version is not true, or rather, it is only partially true. And the part that gets left out is the part that mattered most to Marvin himself. Because Marvin did not experience that moment as a victory. He experienced it the way he experienced almost everything in his life, from a distance, through glass, unable to fully believe it was happening to him. It was sometime in the late 1960s, and James Brown had already built a cathedral around himself, not just with his music, but with the idea of himself, the energy, the sweat, the absolute command of a room. When James Brown walked onto a stage, there was no ambiguity about who was in charge. His band understood this. His audience understood this. And the music industry, which had spent years trying to classify and contain him, eventually stopped trying and simply accepted that he was a category of his own. He was not soft. He was not quiet. He was not the kind of man who sat alone in a room wondering if he deserved the attention he received. Marvin was exactly that kind of man. He had been recording for Motown since the early 1960s, working through the label's precise machinery, hitting the marks that Berry Gordy set for him, wearing the suits, smiling for the photographs. By the time the two men found themselves in the same orbit, through industry functions, through mutual acquaintances, through the overlapping geography of Black American music, Marvin had achieved a level of commercial success that should have made him feel secure. It did not. It never did. Success for Marvin always arrived with a shadow attached to it, a quiet voice underneath the applause that asked whether any of it was real, whether he had truly earned it, or whether the machine around him was responsible for everything, and he was simply standing in the right place. James Brown did not appear to have that voice, and Marvin, watching him from across a room, was not sure whether to envy that or distrust it. The comment, the one that would later take on the weight of a defining moment, was not delivered as a formal critique. It was the kind of thing that men like James Brown said without necessarily meaning to wound, because men like James Brown often did not consider that their words could wound someone like Marvin. Too soft. That was the substance of it. Too soft for what Brown considered real soul music. Too polished, too careful, too contained within the Motown wrapper that had been designed to make white radio comfortable. It was not entirely wrong, and that was the problem. Marvin knew it was not entirely wrong. He had been fighting that wrapper for years, pushing against the romantic ballads and the carefully arranged production, trying to find something underneath that felt honest. He had not yet found it. And here was James Brown, without even trying, pointing at the exact wound. What Marvin felt in that moment was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. What he felt was closer to confirmation, the familiar sinking recognition that someone had seen the thing he most tried to hide. That beneath the smooth surface, beneath the voice that could seduce and comfort and make people feel things they didn't know they needed to feel, there was something fragile, something that had never fully hardened into the confidence that the music business demanded. He did not respond. He nodded or said something neutral, and he carried the comment home with him the way he carried most things, quietly internally, where it would sit and expand in the dark. He was not fine. He had not been fine for a while. Tammy Terrell had collapsed on stage the previous year, and whatever stability Marvin had constructed around himself collapsed with her. He was still recording, still performing, still delivering the product that Motown needed, but the interior scaffolding was gone. He had started using marijuana more heavily, finding in it a kind of muffled distance from the anxiety that otherwise followed him everywhere. He was fighting with Berry Gordy about creative direction, about the kind of music he wanted to make, about whether Motown would ever allow him to be something other than what it had decided he was. And underneath all of it, beneath the grief and the anger and the industry politics, there was the older wound, the one that had never properly healed because it had never been properly acknowledged. His father had told him for years that he was nothing, had said it with fists sometimes and with silence other times, and with the particular cruelty of a man who believed he was administering discipline when he was actually administering damage. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a minister a man who stood in front of congregations and spoke about mercy, and who came home and practiced something else entirely. Marvin had grown up inside that contradiction, the public face of righteousness, the private reality of fear, and he had never quite left it. He carried it into every room he entered, every relationship he tried to build, every stage he stood on. The voice that asked whether he deserved the attention was his father's voice. It had always been his father's voice. James Brown's comments settled into that existing wound and made itself comfortable there. What happened next is the part of the story that people remember, because it is the part that looks like triumph. Marvin went back to the studio. Not immediately. There were months of drifting first, months of Motown obligations and industry events, and the slow private unraveling that was becoming harder to hide. But eventually Marvin went back to the studio with something different in mind. He had been sitting with his brother Frankie's stories from Vietnam, with the news coming through the television every night, with the deaths that kept accumulating in the world outside the Motown machine. And he had started to understand that the music he had been making, however beautiful, however commercially successful, had nothing to do with any of it. He began writing What's Going On. The process was not clean. It was not the story of a man who receives criticism and channels it directly into masterpiece. It was messier and slower than that, full of false starts and arguments, and days when Marvin sat at the piano and produced nothing because the grief was too heavy to move through. He was trying to make music that told the truth, and he had spent his entire career making music that told a specific kind of comfortable lie, and the transition was not seamless. There were sessions where he sat alone in the studio after the engineers had left, talking into the darkness, working through thoughts that had no clear destination. Berry Gordy heard the early recordings and told Marvin it was uncommercial, told him that Motown did not release music like this, that the label's audience did not want to hear about war and poverty and spiritual crisis, that Marvin was making a mistake he would regret. Gordy was not trying to be cruel. He was operating from a position that had worked for over a decade, a careful, strategic vision of what black music could be in a mainstream market and what it should avoid. But Marvin was done operating within someone else's vision. He told Gordy that if the album was not released, he would not record another note for Motown. Ever. Gordy released it, May 1971, and the response was not what Gordy had predicted and not exactly what Marvin had expected either, because the scale of it was difficult to absorb. Critics called it a turning point in soul music. Audiences received it as though they had been waiting for exactly this without knowing they had been waiting. The album moved through the culture like something that had been necessary for a long time and had finally arrived. Radio stations that had been playing Marvin's romantic ballads now played a different kind of Marvin, one who was asking questions rather than providing reassurance, one who was present in the world rather than hovering above it in the soft light of manufactured romance. James Brown heard it. He did not say much about it publicly. The music industry was not, in that era, a place where prominent men went out of their way to acknowledge that someone else had changed the terms of the conversation. But the people around him, musicians, producers, people who knew what Brown's silences meant, understood. The album represented something that Brown's model of dominance had not prepared for. Not a more powerful version of what he was doing, but a different register entirely. Where Brown's music said, "Here I am," Marvin's music said, "Where are we going?" The two questions belonged to different traditions, and What's Going On had just demonstrated that the second tradition had depths that the industry had not yet explored. Marvin did not celebrate. That is the part that gets dropped from the simpler version of the story. He was relieved that the album existed. He was glad that it had been heard. But the private experience of that period was not triumphant. It was exhausted. And beneath the exhaustion, there was still the same fundamental unease that had always been there. The wound that James Brown's comment had touched was not closed by the album's success. Success did not work that way for Marvin. It never had. Each achievement arrived and then receded, and the voice underneath was still there, asking its questions, refusing to be answered by the applause. He knew that What's Going On was honest in a way his earlier music had not been, but honesty had a cost. It required him to acknowledge things he had spent years carefully not acknowledging. The grief, the fear, the loneliness that fame had made worse rather than better. Making the album had opened something in him that he could not fully close again, and in the years that followed, that openness would make him both more creative and more vulnerable, more capable of producing work that mattered and more susceptible to the darkness that was always pressing against the edges of his life. His father's voice did not stop. His father was still alive, still living the contradiction, still the original wound underneath all the other wounds. And Marvin, even after what's going on, even after the critical recognition and the cultural impact and the silence that had fallen over people who had once spoken lightly about what he was capable of, even after all of that, would come home and still not know what to do with the man who had first told him he was nothing. That is the part of the story that does not fit into the cleaner version. That Marvin spent years after what's going on unable to fully inhabit the person the album suggested he was. That the man who made music about healing was not healed. That the recognition he received from his peers, including quietly from the man who had once dismissed him, did not reach the place inside him where the damage lived. He kept recording. He kept performing eventually after years of refusing the stage. He kept finding the studio and sitting down at the piano and trying to make something honest out of what he found inside himself. And sometimes he succeeded, and the music that emerged was extraordinary, layered and searching and emotionally precise in ways that took listeners somewhere they had not expected to go. And sometimes the darkness won, and the sessions dissolved into silence or into recordings that would never be finished, or into long nights that the engineers would later describe carefully and without detail. What Brown's comment had done in the end was not wound Marvin into silence. It had located something that was already there, a question about whether the softness in his music was weakness or whether it was something else entirely, something that the harder, more dominant tradition could not access. What's Going On answered that question, not with an argument, not with a confrontation, but with music that went somewhere the argument could not follow. Brown understood this. The silence was not defeat. It was recognition. A man who had built his authority on presence and power, sitting with the knowledge that someone had found another way in, a quieter way, a way that cost more to walk because it required the kind of honesty that performance cannot provide. Marvin never claimed the silence as a victory. He barely claimed the album as his own, in the sense that he could never quite believe that what had come out of that dark period was really what people were hearing. He would listen to recordings of himself and feel a kind of distance from the voice, as if the man who had made the music was someone he had glimpsed briefly and then lost track of. That distance followed him for the rest of his life. So did the music.